This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thanks for tuning in this week's NC Spin. Most of us enjoyed some relief with cooler temperatures this week, but there were still some heated issues, and we want to discuss them with you. We begin by a brief recap of Tuesday's municipal elections. Before looking at what might be the longest legislative session on record, we'll ask our panel to talk about what remains to be done and when lawmakers might go home. Then we look at the ongoing war between the State Superintendent of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education, and of course we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of which, this week's panel includes Chris Fitzsimon, Director of the Newsroom, Rufus Edmisten, former Attorney General and former Secretary of State, Donna Martinez with WPTF Radio and the John Locke Foundation, and Rick Henderson, the Editor-in-Chief of Carolina Journal. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
They're up before dawn and work late into the night. They believe in hard work, family, and doing the right thing. They stand up for their communities when others walk away. They're good people who just want a fair shake. They are farmers. At North Carolina Farm Bureau, we are proud to stand with our farmers.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
Production underwriting provided by the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Let's get started. Tuesday was election day in many municipalities in our state. We want to comment on some of the outcomes. Chris, we've got a possible mayoral runoff elections in Raleigh, High Point, and Rocky Mount. Any other big surprises that you saw?
No, not really. I mean, I think it's good that we had a lot of qualified people run. It looks like we're going to have voters are going to have another chance. We may even have, it's not clear in High Point, we might have to have a recount before we have a runoff because the second place finishers were so close to each other. The biggest city obviously was Raleigh, where in some ways we had a repeat of what happened last time with different candidates. Marianne Baldwin didn't have as much as the Nancy McFarland won last time. Charles Francis came in second, as he did last time. Last time he called for a runoff, which McFarland won handily. Obviously, McFarland was an incumbent and had probably even more name recognition than Marianne Baldwin. I don't think there's a giant message other than it does seem that there is a lot of interest in politics. People talked a lot, I think, about these on the local level, which I think is good.
Yeah. Rick, there's going to be a new face to the city council in Raleigh, speaking of Raleigh elections, because a number of incumbents did not get reelected, right, and there were a couple of retirements from the board. Is this a resumption of the old pro-growth versus neighborhood kind of argument in Raleigh?
Some of that's going on. There's also a possibility, depending on the runoff situation, that another incumbent, Russ Stevenson, will not prevail for another term. I think you did see some backlash in a way to some of the policies that were taking place on the council. You saw Charles Francis earlier made this in his race for mayor, that there was not a lot of concern about the effects of growth in Raleigh on some of the lower income communities and the minority communities, and whether or not there would be enough affordable housing. At the same time, you had the issue of what we talked about as vibrancy in the community, that Nancy McFarland was promoting a lot of growth, but she didn't want too much growth. She wanted the downtown to be restored, but once it got out of hand, then she said, well, no, let's clamp down on this. And so, and I think Marianne Baldwin was sort of a response to that as well.
Donna, typically in these bodies, people can have differences of philosophy, differences of opinion, but once the elections are over with, there usually is a fair amount of collegiality. The city council in Raleigh has not gotten along well with each other lately.
No, and I think that in some ways people are hoping that it will change, but in some ways they're not, because I think there is a message out of the Raleigh mayoral race for 2020 and kind of the culture of politics that we're living in today. In the case of the Raleigh mayor's race, Marianne Baldwin really has a reputation as a fighter. as someone who speaks her mind, not afraid to disagree, and not afraid to reach across the aisle. Charles Francis has the reputation of someone who's talking about the so-called forgotten populations, people that have somehow been left behind. And I call that the fighter mentality. We see it at the federal level right now with the president. I think that is the political nature that we are now dealing with, and I think it's going to head into 2020.
I was getting ready to say, anything else that Rufus, that you saw that might be sort of clues as to what we expect in 2020?
Well, the same old, but unseen, unbelievable amounts of money spent on elections like this.
Yeah.
Millions of dollars were spent on the mayoral race and on city council races, which I find just appalling that we can't do something about huge gobs of money in elections, and I don't know what to do about it.
My mailbox was just crammed, seemed like every day, with flyers from people. Let's change subject. Aside from that weird legislative session in 2016, this year's legislative session may set the record for the longest in state history, and no end is evident. Most believe this would have ended months ago had the budget been resolved. Governor Cooper vetoed it. The Republican-controlled Senate needs at least one Democrat to vote in favor of an override to get it done. And Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger has accused Governor Cooper of threatening to find a primary challenger to any Senate Democrat who breaks ranks and votes for the override. Rufus, you've been around for a while. Is this just politics as usual? Haven't both parties sort of participated in these kinds of antics?
Well, I agree with you on one thing. I've been around a long time.
And we're glad of that.
Yeah. There's nothing new about this. I remember back in days when even the Republican legislature didn't pay any attention to their own governor, Governor Pat McCrory. We've had instance after instance where they went into October, but nothing like this. I've never seen one subject tie up the whole legislature like Medicaid expansion has. And in other words, a lot of people think that their budget is warped because they can't get on with the new budget. But somehow I heard someone the other day say, well, that's good because it's less government if they stay that way. And I said, well, I can't disagree with that much, but I don't know when it's going to break up. It'll have to be a new session to break it up,
well,
I think.
Senate President Phil Berger, Pro Tem Phil Berger. By the way, the Senate has been adjourned. They're not coming back until the 21st of this month. But Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger says he's ready to go home. He indicated that there might be some action here. He needs one Democrat to cross the aisle and vote for this override. And the rumors that have been going around Raleigh recently is that one Democrat might be Don Davis from Pitt County, principally because there's a $200 million building for East Carolina's med school that's contained in that budget. However, Cooper has pretty well put the word out along with the other Democrats. You override this budget, you're going to have a primary challenger. So far as it goes, do you think they can override it?
I think it's possible, but really 50-50 at this point. It was interesting that Davis sent this letter that became public to Secretary of Health and Human Services Mandy Cohen and said, I have questions about Medicaid based on some comments that State Auditor Beth Wood had made on a radio show.
On Henry Hinton's radio show down in Greenville, yeah.
Exactly, and Beth Wood had been talking about how the system has problems and that we shouldn't be adding people into a system that's already broken. And so Davis said, look, I want to know answers to this. Secretary Cohen essentially responds, well, that's kind of old news.
It is old news.
And
this was released,
and things are fine.
Yeah, this was released back in May or June of this year.
But I kind of felt like that was a signal from Davis that he was questioning.
But Chris, help me with this. This is dealing with MCOs, managed care organizations, right. Not in Medicaid, by the way, but with mental health. I thought the deal with MCOs was you get a pot of money for each person, and if you spend less than that, you get to keep it. On the other hand, if it costs you more, it's got to come out of your pocket. So the big complaint here is that some of these MCOs have huge surpluses that they're carrying over.
Right, and I think this is very complicated in many ways. There's also the move to privatization, which the Cooper administration supports for Medicaid, although it has caused problems in other states. I think there's some people who are concerned about that. But remember, Senator Davis, after the It was only a couple of weeks ago where he said even though he voted for the budget, he was not going to vote to override the veto. Now, he may be reconsidering that, but he is on the record saying he's not going to vote to override the veto.
Well, you were talking about Henry Hinton. He was on Henry Hinton's radio show Friday, and I picked up, Henry pressed him. Are you going to vote to override the veto? And great politician that he is, Davis would not make any kind of commitment. Meantime, the House is over there, and they're getting ready to pass HB 655, which would expand Medicaid, but would require a working requirement as well as a contribution each month, a premium, if you will, to expand Medicaid. This thing's been lying around here for a while, and Speaker Moore hasn't brought it to the floor. Is there any reason why? Does he not have the votes?
He probably doesn't have the votes among his own caucus to pass it. That's one of the things, certainly this is true in the Senate, that if the Senate leader, and this has happened with both parties, if the Senate leader doesn't have the support of his own caucus, he's not going to bring a bill to the floor, even if it has enough bipartisan support to pass. I don't think he's got the support of his own caucus to pass this. And also, there are questions that are legitimate questions about whether or not a work requirement would withstand a court challenge, and whether or
other
not
states have it, don't they?
They've also had it tied up in court too, and also whether a premium is something you can actually expect of someone and collect. Again, that's something else that's been a subject for court battles. And so if you take those two things out, then House Bill 655 is Medicaid expansion.
But Donna, even regardless of how this bill might pass the House, if it passes the House, Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger has just said nix. Ixnay.
Exactly.
It ain't coming into the
It's
Senate.
not going anywhere, at least in this session. Important to keep in mind that the so-called Medicaid light bill, it's Medicaid expansion. The only difference, it's the same number of people, same cost. The only difference is the work requirement and the small premiums. So that's why the votes aren't there, because the caucus is not for this. But, you know, depending on the politics of next year, the Democrats are going to press.
You know, the work requirement has just always bothered me. You're helping people that are not able to help themselves. And transportation, that's always a big problem. Nobody thinks of that. To go to work, you got to have some kind of an old trap of a car. You're getting this because you're unable to pay premiums otherwise.
Well, Bill Clinton instituted this work requirement back when he was president, and nobody seemed to be objecting to it then.
Not the same, not for Medicaid,
not for Medicaid,
right,
but for social welfare, whatever.
So it's easy to say work requirement, and to accomplish it is something else, because you already have a burden on the people that we want to cover under this Medicaid expansion anyway.
It is interesting. Rick is right about the general practice of the caucus doesn't take something up unless there's a majority. But I do believe the majority of the House would vote for this bill if there was a vote on it. It was a bipartisan vote.
I think it would pass.
Well, it would, and there was a bipartisan vote in committee. So there is an argument to be made, a political argument largely, that the majority of the House wants to pass this bill and put it in the lap of the Senate.
So let's just assume that the bill passes, House and Senate.
Right.
Is Cooper then going to say, okay, I'm withdrawing my objection, Democrats vote for this budget and let's get rid of it? Or are we going to keep seeing these little mini budget bills?
I think that was not going to make a bit of difference to the governor, because for one thing, you will see people immediately take that to court. So it'll be tied up in court immediately. There will be a stay imposed on it. And I actually think they're going to be out of here by Halloween. I really do. The House is taking off
back
next
into
week.
session on until the 21st,
Right.
Rick, and they've got a lot of issues that have got to be discussed.
They're not
this
going
is
to
one
deal
of
with
them.
They're not going to deal with them. They're going to pass a few more mini budgets. They're probably going to pass a teacher pay increase. It's not going to be as much as the governor wants, but it's going to be about what the House and Senate agreed on. And then they're going to go home. They're going to have to come back and redistrict at some point. But Senator Berger made it pretty clear in a press conference he had a couple of weeks ago that they would be happy to come back in January after candidate filing is over and these so-called threats are gone to see then.
Well, he said earlier this week that they're going to be getting out of here. But there is much work to be done. And one of the things that is involved with this, Donna, is Senate Bill 559, which is the Duke Energy Bill, which gives Duke the ability to be able to establish their rates for 3 years running rather than having to go back through the State Utilities Commission. This has been an interesting piece of legislation. It came up in the House after the Senate introduced it and passed an earlier version of it. Came up in the House. The House voted to put it into a study committee. Well, the Senate came back and said, we don't want that. They caucused with some of the House members, revised the thing a little bit. They voted on it. It's back in the House now. Anything going to happen with it?
It should have gone to a study commission. This is a really complex issue here, and I have concerns about being able to set rates for 3 years in advance. We have a watchdog, a utilities commission, for a reason, to watch out for ratepayers. Now, Duke is correct. It's all about the modernization of the grid, particularly if you're going to push, as the governor and Democrats are doing, for renewables. That has a lot of impact on the grid, plus the population growth, et cetera. It's a 50-year-old system. So we have to talk about it. But to just say, well, we're just going to go ahead and pass it and let them have 3 years, I think poor policy
And
making.
Rufus, a lot of this revolves around contributions that Duke Energy PAC made to leading senators and legislators, some $41,000 they contributed to 8 members of the General Assembly, $5,200 each, back last December. They later came back and said, hey, you got to give those back to us. But NC Warren has really been on a tear with a campaign about this, saying that this is just corrupt politics. This bill doesn't need to go anywhere. It is bad for North Carolina, and Governor Cooper needs to veto it.
And I noticed that their ads in the newspaper are bipartisan. They're not only to one political party. One of the biggest problems I had when I was Attorney General was representing the people before the Utilities Commission. 1 year, Donna, is not. It's sort of like people running for Congress. 2 years, you're spending the whole 2 years running again. With a 1 year planning cycle on Utility Commission, it is not. Well, I would say do 2.
But Donna is correct. These are complicated
Donna is
issues.
Exactly right. I don't generally agree with Donna,
thank you,
but
Chris.
she is absolutely right. This is ridiculous to pass this big a piece of legislation without a long study. Everybody has a chance to testify. We really get to look at what's happening here. We do have a Utilities Commission. I don't know many people in Raleigh that think Duke has trouble now getting their rate increases and has too little power in the process.
Well,
This
Duke
is
has
very
some
dangerous.
problems of Blue Cross. Want to move to that in just a second. Final question: is this bill going to pass?
No.
No.
I hope not. I'm worried it might still.
Would Cooper veto it if it did?
Yes.
Probably so.
Let's move on to Blue Cross Blue Shield, because that's another one of the big issues that is involved here. Back to the Medicaid to a certain extent. They've got some real problems within the company. Their CEO was arrested and charged with driving while impaired. There's evidence that there was contact made with the state insurance commissioner to keep the whole
And there were
thing
children in the car, by the way.
hush
Part
hush.
of the story.
That's right.
And
Blue
his
Cross,
behavior.
Right.
Blue Cross was criticized for the handling of this whole thing, that the board was trying to sweep it under the rug and so forth like that. Last week, Blue Cross came out saying that they were going to turn a new leaf. They were going to be more transparent, particularly with the Commissioner of Insurance. Is that going to improve relationships and help them?
Well, it's kind of easy after you've already screwed up one time. It's easy to promise transparency because they really made a ton of mistakes this time around. There was a legal requirement for them to have notified regulators within 2 days of Dr. Conway's arrest, and they did not. And the only reason I think that the media found out about it was that someone videotaped this his trip and leaked it to the press. And so otherwise we would not have known about it for the longest time. And Blue Cross's board basically tried to suppress this information getting out. So there was a possibility that there were going to be multiple
I think there was some
lawsuits.
evidence that Blue Cross's board wasn't fully informed when they made some of the decisions.
There were a lot of rumblings going on that in the states out west, where Blue Cross was going to engage in an affiliation with the Blue out there, that they were going to possibly sue Blue Cross for not doing this.
This prevented a big merger that was going to take place. A lot of people who are familiar with this say that Mike Causey wouldn't have approved that merger anyway.
Well, possibly not. This certainly didn't help. Blue Cross has a giant problem here, I think, in just public confidence in the way they did react to this whole situation. Their number one thing now, they have to restore confidence of their people who are subscribers, but also the policymakers and the infrastructure that regulates them. They have a big job to do.
Donna, let's look at some other issues that are still out there. We still don't have a farm bill. There's still big arguments going on in the House about smokable hemp. And the big arguments really have to do with when do we start a moratorium? And it seems to me like they're just arguing over calendar here. Any movement with this? Do you think anything's going to happen with this farm bill, or are we just going to adjourn without one?
Well, I think it's over law enforcement, and unless you get that piece of this story in place, law enforcement has the concern that at least now they don't have the technology to be able to discern if someone has marijuana or if they have smokable hemp, which doesn't contain the properties that get you high. And that's an important public safety feature, as well as rights of people who are pulled over. So until that piece is in place, now you would think that research-wise, where we're sitting in North Carolina, that we would have, we've got research facilities, public and private, who would be able to come up with this technology to take care of it.
Our state of North Carolina Department of Agriculture.
Sure.
And
There are
North Carolina
tests
State
available.
University.
They're just difficult to administer at the field level, and they are expensive.
Rufus,
Well, I think there are more pressing problems than whether or
I
not.
was getting ready to say there's some other issues here.
Yeah,
DOT's got this big funding problem. They need some resolution and perhaps some
there are
an
a lot of
infusion of
rapes
cash.
and murders and robberies and things. My love for law enforcement must not be taken as a negative here on law enforcement, but they're squabbling over basically a de minimis matter, because I don't believe that whether or not you can distinguish between smoking or not. If somebody's impaired, it doesn't have to be dope.
Let's move on to a different subject. In 2016, Mark Johnson defeated the long-term superintendent of public instruction, June Atkinson. But in those 2 years running DPI, you'd have to describe his leadership as rocky. Some accuse him of wanting to become an education czar. He's had conflicts with teachers, the State Board of Education, to some extent the legislature. The latest flap has been over laptop computers. Following a controversial expense-paid trip to California, he purchased nearly $6 million worth of Apple iPads. And when asked this summer why some 3,000 of them remained in warehouses, Johnson said they would be distributed before school started. Well, last week the State Board of Education asked again how he chose which schools would get them. He responded he gave them to the people who requested them. Donna, the controversy started when Johnson, 3 lawmakers and 2 superintendents received meals, transportation, and so forth from Apple. What's your take on this?
Well, I give the superintendent an A for his get-her-done attitude, but he gets a C- for communication and working well with others. This latest issue of the latest round of laptops, I think it was completely appropriate for the state board to say, hey, how are you giving these out? And he said, well, send me an email.
I sent him one, by the way. I still haven't.
But here's the thing. It's an issue of his discretionary fund. He says he can spend that money any way he wants, as did previous superintendents.
Chris, then there's this news that was released this past week about he's sending out bookmarks and pamphlets and flyers and posters and so forth like that, and people are saying, hey, this looks like campaign literature.
It does look a lot like campaign literature.
He says, no, as superintendent, I need to promote what's going good in education.
He needs to promote it with this picture on it and a lot of information about himself. He clearly has, I think he's either campaigning hard for re-election, or he might be, the rumor has been that he had being considered running for lieutenant governor. Either way, he's having a hard time.
Speaking of promoting, I want to get to the segment of Tell Us Something We Don't Know. And I want to begin, Rufus, with you, because your Super Kids fundraiser is going to be taking place October 30th. Tell us what you do in this fundraiser.
This is the 25th anniversary of the Super Kids program. We take kids who's overcome adversity, Tom. You've seen them at the program. We say if you stay straight, you stay in school, you are a good example to other people, we'll help you go to college. We have 39 graduates now who would not have gotten to go to college otherwise. And you get a great meal at the Farmers Market Restaurant on the 30th. And I invite people to come out and really see some great kids.
More food than you can possibly
Absolutely.
eat. And a lot of the NC Spend panel, by the way, comes to this every year. So if you want to see and talk to some of us, you'll find us at Rufus' Super Kids fundraiser. October 30th, 6 to 9 p.m., State Farmers Market
Thank you,
Restaurant.
Tom, very
All right,
much.
tell us something we don't know, Chris.
Apparently, Tom Tillis is worried about his primary opponent, Garland Tucker, in the U.S. Senate race. It's the only explanation I can think of why he's one of the only senators who has not broken from President Trump on his abandonment of the Kurds in northern Syria. Lindsey Graham, a lot of diehard Trump supporters are saying that was the wrong decision. Tillis has refused to condemn it. He must be worried about his right flank.
Rick Henderson, tell us something we don't know.
Carolina Journal this week is starting a new feature, reviving one that's available to everyone. It's called a Weekend Review. You can get it on our website, and please check it out.
Donna, tell us something we don't know.
Speaking of President Trump, you never know where he's going to turn up. I'm listening to an audiobook, the autobiography of Burt Reynolds, the late actor. There's a chapter on Donald Trump and the USFL, and Reynolds essentially blames businessman Donald Trump for the folding of the USFL. It's fascinating.
Wow. How about that?
Yeah, there you
I would
go.
have never have thought that.
Me neither.
You've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter. Give your feedback and read my weekly column. Be sure to visit our ncspin.com website or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our podcast and also to our YouTube channel. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
They're up before dawn and work late into the night. They believe in hard work, family, and doing the right thing. They stand up for their communities when others walk away. They're good people who just want a fair shake. They are farmers. At North Carolina Farm Bureau, we are proud to stand with our farmers.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
Production underwriting provided by the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.